Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. My name is Jeremy Nettles. I am the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ that meets in Newburgh, Indiana. If you would like to get in touch with us, then you can give us a call at 812-550-6234. You can also send email to info@riverridgechurch.org. You can find us on our Facebook page. You can even leave a comment on our YouTube channel if that is the best way for you to get in touch with us. You can sign up for a study with me or with another of our members. You can also sign up for a sort of an at-home study through the mail, where we would send you out material that you can use with your own Bible on your own time to study, fill it out, and then mail it back to me. We do that free of charge, just like everything else that we offer to the public. You can find our website, which is just riverridgechurch.org, and there are lots of resources on there, including articles that I have written every week, as well as a lot of past articles and other study materials and that sort of thing. And you can find on that same website a link to our weekly live-streamed worship services. If you would like to tune into that, you can find our Bible study on Sunday mornings at 9, our worship service at 10, and then again another afternoon worship service at 4 p.m. You are also welcome to find our radio show here locally on 98.5 FM, also on 1400 AM. That's also called Iron Sharpens Iron because I'm not all that creative. And sometimes we're doing audio from these TV programs, but about the other half of the time it's completely unique material. So I encourage you, if you're in the Evansville area, to tune into that as well. We use all these avenues to reach out to the public because we know that there are people out there who want to know more about God and His expectations of them and what they need to do in order to be saved and how they ought to live their lives in order for God to be pleased with them when the day of judgment arrives. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to grant to those who mourn in Zion, to give them a beautiful headdress instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the garment of praise instead of a faint spirit, that they may be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that He may be glorified. They shall build up the ancient ruins, they shall raise up the former devastations, they shall repair the ruined cities, the devastations of many generations. In the 4th chapter of Luke's Gospel, Jesus read this passage from Isaiah 61 in a public setting. It was in the synagogue on a Sabbath day when all of the people of the town were gathered to study and to worship God. He read this passage and he told the people that it was being fulfilled right in front of their eyes. And they threw him out of town. Why would they do that? Well, they realized what he meant. He was saying that this is the beginning of the Messiah's ministry. He meant that what he was doing was the direct fulfillment of this prophecy. He was claiming that God's Spirit rested on him. He was claiming that he was anointed by God. He was claiming to bring good news. That's what the word gospel means, good news. Jesus was saying he proclaimed liberty to captives, and sight to the blind, and comfort to those who were oppressed, and all of those sorts of things. This whole passage is steeped in the common knowledge of Isaiah's day, that there were people who were suffering these sorts of afflictions. There were, of course, people who were poor, who were brokenhearted, who were captive, who were bound. And there was also a year of the Lord's favor. What is that? Today we are going to look at God's law in the Old Testament, and we're going to find this year, and we're going to find what God wanted to teach His people about this year. And then finally we will see why it matters to us. We've got a pretty simple roadmap for today. We'll spend most of our remaining time in the book of Leviticus, and specifically in the 25th chapter of that book. This chapter starts out with some notes about the Sabbath year, which is essentially God's stipulation in His law to leave a field fallow every 7th year, to not sow it with crops, in order to let the land rest. And then we come to verse 8. You shall count 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the time of the 7 weeks of years shall give you 49 years. Then you shall sound the loud trumpet on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the day of atonement you shall sound the trumpet throughout all your land. And you shall consecrate the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, when each of you shall return to his property, and each of you shall return to his clan. That 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. In it you shall neither sow, nor reap what grows of itself, nor gather the grapes from the undressed vines. For it is a jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You may eat the produce of the field. So this 50th year, this is the year of the Lord's favor. That would mean in the typical adult lifetime, on average, each person would experience this once. If you were, say, very young, the first time it came around, you probably wouldn't remember, let alone appreciate what was happening, but you would remember and very much appreciate when it came around again. So what's supposed to happen in this year of the Lord's favor? Well, he specifically mentions leaving the land fallow like they were supposed to do in every 7th year, but there's more than that. As the chapter continues, he explains that it is to be a year of liberty, that slaves are to be released, that property is to be returned to its owners, as we read here in verse 10. It shall be a jubilee for you when each of you shall return to his property, and each of you shall return to his clan. So we've got the return of property to its ancestral owners, and we've got the return to property by the descendants of those ancestral owners. So this is very exceptional. Let's keep reading. Verse 13. In this year of Jubilee, each of you shall return to his property. And if you make a sale to your neighbor, or buy from your neighbor, you shall not wrong one another. You shall pay your neighbor according to the number of years after the Jubilee, and he shall sell to you according to the number of years for crops. If the years are many, you shall increase the price. And if the years are few, you shall reduce the price. For it is the number of the crops that he is selling to you. You shall not wrong one another, but you shall fear your God, for I am the Lord your God. There's a lot going on here. So it mentions the sale of property, but it says that these sales are not to be forever. In the year of the Jubilee, the property is to go back to its rightful owners according to the inheritance that God had divided among the Israelites and their tribes and their clans and their fathers' houses. If you want to see an example, although you have to dig a little bit in order to understand it, then look at the way that Joseph, Mary's husband in the New Testament, handles his obligation to be counted among the sons of David in order to honor this provision in the law. You can read about that at the beginning of Luke chapter 2, of course. And God even says that this Jubilee is to be taken into account, that you're supposed to decide on a price and agree on a price between the purchaser and the seller based on how soon the Jubilee is going to come around, because it wouldn't be fair to sell your property the year after the Jubilee for one price and then sell an equivalent property the year before the Jubilee for the same price. It's not the same value. Selling it in the year before the Jubilee only gets you 1 year's worth of use out of this land. So it's almost like a lease rather than a sale. And they're to take into account the term of the lease, and that it will expire when the 50th year comes around. Let's skip a little bit and pick up in verse 23, where we will see this being stated a little bit more clearly. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. For you are strangers and sojourners with me, and in all the country you possess you shall allow a redemption of the land. This, by the way, helps to explain what's going on in the book of Ruth a little bit later during the period of the Judges. They had apparently sold their land, Naomi had, when they left from the district of Bethlehem during a famine and crossed over the River Jordan into the land of Moab in order to preserve their lives. Well, when Naomi and Ruth come back over, they have sold that land, but it's still tied to them. And they spend the entirety of that book looking for somebody to redeem that land on their behalf and to provide for them at the same time. The rest of this chapter, Leviticus 25, details that the year of Jubilee is to bring about freedom for slaves, is to bring about the return of houses to their proper owners. There's a very careful delineation about how each case is to be dealt with, and a very firm principle behind the whole thing. What was all of this intended to accomplish? What God was trying to do was to secure steady occupation of ancestral lands. He wants the people to be tied to the land and less likely to leave the borders of Israel and settle among the Gentile nations around them. That's one reason for it. It also incentivized maintenance of tribal identity, because if a man from the tribe of Reuben decides to marry a woman from the tribe of Simeon, well, they come from very different parts of the nation, of the country of Israel, different territories. And how do they decide exactly who ends up with what land? It starts to get hairy. And so if they would marry among themselves, basically maintaining their same tribal and clan and father's house identity, then they would also maintain their heritage. They would maintain their lineage. And those things would, of course, become important in a spiritual sense when it came to Christ, who is to be the offspring specifically of Judah. Not just of Abraham, not just of Isaac, not just of Jacob, but specifically he's to go through the line of Judah. That was prophesied. You can read about that in Genesis 49. It was also prophesied that the Messiah would come from the lineage of David, several generations after Judah. And so by maintaining this identity through the generations, that demonstrates more clearly who Christ is and why he inherits these particular promises and this particular responsibility. Okay, but God's law throughout the Old Testament is not just about fiddling with little levers and knobs and making a particular outcome. He also constructed it in such a way as to teach his people important things. What in the world does this teach them? Well, it teaches them the value of freedom. They lived in a time when there was no social security, there was no safety net for people who could not provide for their own needs. So what would they do? They would have to sell their ancestral property, which came to them by inheritance. They would have to sell that to somebody. But God wants them to get it back. So that demonstrates the value of property ownership. And on top of that, if someone was really destitute, they would not be able to stop at selling their property. They would have to sell themselves into slavery to somebody else in order to pay off a debt or in order to secure housing and food from someone who could actually provide for them in recompense for their labor over a term of several years or even many, many years. And yet, this was not to go on forever like this. After the Jubilee came, they were to be set free. And so this law demonstrates that God highly values personal freedom. It also highlights individual responsibility. It's not enough to say, I'm free. You can be free, but that includes the freedom to fail. The freedom to fail means that you might have your property, you might have your personal freedom, but if you don't actually do a good job of working the property, or even if it's just that circumstances go in the wrong direction as far as you're concerned, then you very well might end up starving to death or having to sell your property or yourself or what have you. And God is trying to make it clear that individuals have a responsibility to avoid those sorts of ends. He talks about redemption. We briefly mentioned that earlier, and it says, for example, in verse 25, if your brother becomes poor and sells part of his property, then his nearest redeemer shall come and redeem what his brother has sold. If a man has no one to redeem it and then himself becomes prosperous and finds sufficient means to redeem it, let him calculate the years since he sold it and pay back the balance to the man to whom he sold it, and then return to his property. But if he does not have sufficient means to recover it, then what he sold shall remain in the hand of the buyer until the year of Jubilee. In the Jubilee it shall be released, and he shall return to his property. Notice, nowhere does this say that you may redeem your brother's property, or that you may redeem your own property. It says you shall. God expects them to do this. He expects them to put themselves in that risky position of taking care of their own needs, of being the head of the household, of being the lord of the manor, so to speak. At the same time, when he says that you should do it for your brother as well, that is a way of demonstrating to them the value of family relationships and responsibility. Essentially, all of this comes together. We talk about freedom and property and individual responsibility and family relationships. He's basically highlighting to them the value of home. Home. But we're not done here. if you're anything like me, then you want to know, did the Israelites actually keep this law? Because there are plenty of laws that they didn't. Well, I mentioned Joseph a few minutes ago, and a demonstration that he at least seems to appreciate the principle behind this and do his best to fulfill it. I also mentioned Ruth, who, by the way, is part of the same lineage of Jesus, and the story of Ruth centers around the same village, Bethlehem, during the period of the Judges. And during that period, at least that part of this law, the redemption of property, seems to be in effect. After that, though, there's a dry spell of several centuries during which we hear nothing, and we are left with a reasonable suspicion. Let me explain. Now, on second thought, let me read. But if in spite of this you will not listen to me, but walk contrary to me, then I will walk contrary to you in fury, and I myself will discipline you for your sins. He goes on at some length talking about all the curses, and then we pick up in verse 32, and I myself will devastate the land so that your enemies who settle in it shall be appalled at it. And I will scatter you among the nations, and I will unsheathe the sword after you, and your land shall be a desolation, and your cities shall be a waste. Okay, we're still building this impression, but the idea is that if the Israelites disobey God, eventually he's going to give them up and allow them to be taken captive and transplanted to another place and then replaced in the country of Israel with other people, with Gentiles. And then after that, we find verses 34 and 35. Then the land shall enjoy its Sabbaths, as long as it lies desolate, while you are in your enemy's land. Then the land shall rest and enjoy its Sabbaths. As long as it lies desolate, it shall have rest, the rest that it did not have on your Sabbaths when you were dwelling in it. So just after this law of the Jubilee, God is predicting, although in terms of if you disobey, he's predicting that they're not going to keep that law, that they're not going to allow the land to lie fallow every seventh year. They're not going to give it its Sabbaths, and so he's going to have to take matters into his own hands and force them to give the land rest. So that's his prediction. And what happens? Surprise, surprise, exactly what God predicted. And how long did they remain in captivity? Well, 70 years or so. So what's the suggestion based on this? If God is giving the land Sabbath rest to make up for the Sabbath rest that the Israelites did not give to the land in accordance with God's law, and he gives them 70 years, and it's supposed to be every seventh year that the land lies fallow, then that would mean 490 years that the Israelites did not keep the law of the Sabbath for the land. Let's look at another example. Read with me in 2 Chronicles 35, verse 18. No Passover like it had been kept in Israel since the days of Samuel the prophet. None of the kings of Israel had kept such a Passover as was kept by Josiah, and the priests and the Levites, and all Judah and Israel who were present, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Now, this is not saying that the Passover was never kept. In fact, we see examples of it being kept in between those two periods. But it is saying that the Passover wasn't kept in full accordance with the law in the way that it should have been. Given that they weren't all that careful and deliberate about keeping the Passover, given that they weren't very good at keeping the Sabbath year, how likely is it that they bothered with the Jubilee? So we don't really know exactly for sure. We see hints that at least parts of the principle of this law are applied by individuals at times, but we don't have any evidence that there was widespread compliance with the law of the Jubilee. God laid out a beautiful law for his people, a law that highlights the value of home and of family and of responsibility and of property ownership and of freedom. And his people, as with everything else, disobeyed. Now, to what extent is not all that clear, but we just never see this in practice. There is a close analogy to this in Hebrews chapter 3. Let's read verses 16 through 19. For who were those who heard and yet rebelled? Was it not all those who left Egypt led by Moses? And with whom was he provoked for 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but to those who were disobedient? So we see that they were unable to enter because of unbelief. The author of Hebrews is here trying to explain what he reads in Psalm 95 about Israelites who hardened their hearts against God and did not enter his rest. But what does the author of Hebrews tell us? It's not just about them. He says in verse 1 of chapter 4, "Therefore, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. For good news came to us just as to them. But the message they heard did not benefit them, because they were not united by faith with those who listened. For we who have believed enter that rest, as he has said, As I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest, although his works were finished from the foundation of the world. For he has somewhere spoken of the seventh day in this way, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again in this passage he said, They shall not enter my rest. Since therefore it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly received the good news failed to enter because of disobedience, again he appoints a certain day, today, saying through David so long afterward in the words already quoted, Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your heart. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So then, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. What the author of Hebrews is trying to get across to us is that this psalm is not about the ancient Israelites. It's about today. In David's time, centuries afterward, God was using his Spirit to speak of a rest that remained for the faithful. It wasn't just about crossing the Jordan into the Promised Land. There's something beyond that. That is a hint of heaven in the Old Testament. And now the author of Hebrews is pointing out to us, if we couldn't figure it out for ourselves, that promise still stands for us. Don't harden your hearts against him, and instead strive to enter that rest. When Christ came and proclaimed the year of the Lord's favor, he was proclaiming liberty to the captives. He was proclaiming good news to the poor. He was proclaiming sight to the blind and freedom to the oppressed. And we tended to look at all those things as if they were purely physical. And in some ways they were. They certainly were in the law of Moses in Leviticus 25. Some of them were kind of physical, even when Jesus was saying, Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. But more than that, he means the spiritual. Good news to the poor. It's not just that the poor don't have to be poor anymore and that great wealth is available to them in physical terms. It's that great spiritual wealth is available to them. The good news of forgiveness of sins and salvation. Freedom from captivity. It's not just about if you happen to have been enslaved to somebody or sold yourself into slavery in order to pay off a debt, and that Jesus is saying, when I come, I will set you free. He means a much harsher master than any human. He means our slavery to sin. And he says, I will set you free from that. It's a spiritual freedom from a spiritual captivity. Sight to the blind. Yes, he healed people who were blind and he gave them their physical sight back, but he also gave genuine spiritual sight to people who were spiritually blind. He showed them what was real and what mattered. He showed them eternal things, heavenly things. And on we go. Just as the law of Moses was trying to get across a spiritual principle in the course of using physical illustrations, Jesus did the same thing. What do we do with this year of the Lord's favor here on earth? Well, we ought to be showing this same sort of attitude to each other. We should treat each other as family. Not that we are in competition with each other all the time, but that we're working together to reach the same goal. We should have the same attitude toward ownership that God was pushing in Leviticus 25. That ownership of property is important, not just of physical property. Your spirit, your soul belong to you. And you need to take responsibility for them and for their condition. It's not a rental car. It's yours forever. Drive accordingly. We should also take a lesson about values, like don't submit to slavery again. There is great value in freedom. There's also great responsibility in freedom. But if you have submitted to slavery to sin again, then know that it doesn't have to be forever, that there is a way to be freed. We should work to prepare. We should strive to make our heritage our own. We need to keep our eyes on home. And home is not here on earth. Home is the rest that still awaits us. We also should remember that this is a limited time offer. That's what God wanted to teach his people in Leviticus 25. We should take the same hint. We should take advantage of the good news that he has proclaimed to us. It's scary and uncomfortable to be genuinely responsible for ourselves. In some ways, freedom is harder than slavery, if slavery is all that you have ever known. That's not to diminish the experience of all the world's billions of slaves over the entire world, over the entire course of history. Many of those slaves suffered horrible treatment at the hands of their masters. Only in the past few centuries has slavery been anything but the norm. Frankly, it's still the norm, just with lower numbers, and we tend to sweep it under the rug these days. Before the days of Social Security and charity organizations, anyone with a debt they couldn't pay pretty much had to become someone's slave, at least for a time. We shouldn't make that mistake and sell ourselves into sin without taking advantage of the freedom that God offers. Jesus is still proclaiming that offer. Freedom from sin, freedom from despair, freedom from the existential dread that follows us and makes us fear the darkness. That freedom doesn't mean the absence of rules. It doesn't work that way. Imagine how you would look if you cast off all restraint and did exactly what you wanted to do at every moment. You'd be an addict, or a glutton, or a kleptomaniac, or a killer, or maybe just a lazy bum with arteries hardening by the day and atrophied muscles, unable to do what you really need to do, which eventually you would come to desire. Does that sound like freedom? Which master would you prefer? Where do they end? Which one entrusts you with more responsibility? That's the measure of freedom, being told to do something, not forced to do it, and then being held accountable for your own decision in the end. If you want to find out more about this and how to take advantage of the year of the Lord's favor in Christ and find liberty and a wealth of eternal glory, get in touch with us at River Ridge. You can find us on Facebook or YouTube to learn more, or you can reach out directly at 812-550-6234 or info@riverridgechurch.org with questions, to sign up for our weekly bulletin free of charge, to sign up for an appointment to study with me or another of our members. You can also join us at 9 a.m. Sunday for Bible study and 10 a.m. for worship. We gather again at 4 on Sunday afternoon and at 7 p.m. on Wednesday for another study. We'd love to see you there, and we would love to serve beside you in the kingdom of Christ. Thank you for joining me today on Iron Sharpens Iron.